All right. Welcome to my channel, Jerb the Humanist, and I've doing some live streaming today. We got a hangout today with one of my favorite people on the internet, Rabi of Embrace the Void podcast, as well as Philosophers in Space. He's a radical sandwich anarchist, a pro-cannibalism moral philosophy lecturer who promotes ESP pseudoscience, and he doesn't believe in persons. Did I get all that right, Aaron?
All true, 100%.
All of that true.
I like Embrace the Pod. I think that's a good
Embrace the Pod
spin-off show where people can talk about Embrace the Void, like
yeah,
Talking Dead.
It's like the meta podcast for talking about the podcast, kind of like the new Good Place.
There you go.
The new Good Place podcast, which just talks about a show.
Eventually, it'll just be pods all the way down.
I am down for that.
Yeah.
All right. So, I wanted to talk to you about like some philosophy, especially some that you hadn't talked about in other venues. But before we did that, I wanted to talk a bit about just a couple metaphilosophical questions first. So the first off, and I've raised this question before in the Philosophers in Space group on Facebook, but I'm wondering if philosophy is having a moment. I don't know if you know about like the there's sort of a growing modern Stoicism movement led by Massimo Pilucci, and I think Dr. Gregory Sadler is part of that. We're seeing a bit more philosophical media. I don't know if it's a lot, but like the shows like The Good Place and maybe Rick and Morty, I think people are starting to like think about like values and ethics and things like that. And I'm wondering if you have an opinion on that, and maybe if so, do you think it's caused by living in the darkest timeline?
Okay. I think this is a good question. I've been pondering this issue as well. And I'll start off by saying I don't have any hard data to show that that philosophy is having a moment. But as a philosopher, I'm under no burden to wait for that hard data before I make random assertions. I do think it is. I think that what we are seeing is an increase in interest in various kinds of philosophy for a couple of different reasons. I think sort of the reason is rapid technological advancement, especially the internet. So the reason I think the internet is a large cause of this is that we are simultaneously, I think, entering a new age of existential and epistemic despair, as we sort of reminded once again how small our place is in the world, and we're sort of constantly bombarded with images of people who are having better lives than us, and also there's a lot of, I think, room in those virtual realms to question the meaning of all of this, basically. And so that, combined with the wealth of fake news and stuff on the internet, is one of the main reasons I think that people are feeling a void that philosophy is seeking to fill. And then the other one would be, we are all of a sudden thrust into this new virtual realm that is largely a giant debate, right? Everyone is allowed to present their personhood, and then they mostly have to defend it to random strangers. And we've all agreed that this is the new norm. So everyone, I think, wants to get better at defending themselves to random strangers. And so there is an understandable functional interest in logical fallacies and structures of arguments and ways to pick apart opponents. So those are my two theories for why, if it is happening, that's why it's happening.
I'm totally willing to believe that it's confirmation bias, because those are all things I'm involved in as like a deep internet citizen. I guess one other example that just popped into my head as you were talking was like there's like a rebirth in absurdist memes, which like seem to come off of a neo-Dadaist like style, which it according to some people on the internet, on Twitter, which are very reliable sources.
Someone on Reddit told me.
Yeah, the original like Dadaist movement was sort of a response to like nothing really matters in a world where like it sprung up post World War I, and like in a world with all these horrors, no society could possibly have any value. So like thus absurd, intentionally valuist art on the internet.
Yeah, it sort of dovetails with the Discordians that way, in the sense that it's aiming to take the piss out of anything and everything that takes itself seriously. Oop, he froze up a little bit. Oh no. Oh no. You back?
Hold on.
Oh.
Yep, we're back.
Yep.
Yep. I know stoicism is building, and I think antinatalism is kind of a Reddit meme, if it were. It's kind of edgy, so maybe.
Yeah.
We'll see.
But I do think there is a lot of evidence out there. You can point to Westworld, you can point to Black Mirror, you can point to Humans. There's a lot of... I think what we're seeing is that the rebirth of philosophical discourse is mostly being packaged up in science fiction. Even The Good Place is a sort of very well-layered kind of science fiction. But I don't think The Good Place would have done well. I'm surprised it does well now. Like, that's my biggest data point, is that this thing that feels entirely written for me appears to appeal to a large swath of individuals. Right.
It's a good show. One other thing
weirdly
about
specific boon. Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead, sorry.
Your weirdly specific boon. One other thing I wanted to ask about philosophy is about all the cishet white dudes in it, and like that problem.
Yeah.
And I know it's kind of difficult to talk about because like all the history books are just filled with these white dudes. And I'm an engineering major, that it was, it was very much a like male dominated discipline. But like, I find it increasingly hard to like find like more diverse schools of thought without actively seeking it out. Like, I don't know any woman philosophers personally myself, which kind of disappoints me. Like,
yeah, we're trying to work on that on our shows, because they are out there. They totally are. I've got binders full of philosophical women. I do wrestle with this, especially when I teach. And I would say there is some light at the end of the tunnel, if that helps. It's not all the way better, but the textbook that I'm using now is 50% non-cis het white dudes. And I can fill out a syllabus from a single book and have it be at least 50% not cis het white dudes, which I think is substantial progress from the books that I was studying it with, 5 years ago even.
Yeah, it doesn't help that the most famous philosophy woman, as it were, is probably like Ayn Rand or something. So
Simone de Beauvoir, I think, is probably up there as well. But yes, it is unfortunate that she is.
Do you know if there's a reason why, like, are your classes mostly male that you lecture on, or like, are your faculty mostly male? Okay, that's
less so. I mean, I don't. Again, I'd have to look up the numbers to see how much the shift is actually happening and how quickly. But I do think the shift is happening. And the reasons are, historically, those people were excluded, passively and actively. Oftentimes paternalistically, with the idea that those kinds of individuals were not well designed for abstract rational thought. So and it's unfortunate, but I do think that there is a lot of good work going on out there to sort of pull things back, and I'm sure there will be folks who'll be adding us about how that's not necessary or you shouldn't be doing that, but I think it is necessary, because what you realize is, as soon as you read that material, you realize it's just as good as the other material that you've always been reading. And so the idea that you have to stick to this one all male canon that everyone was using for a while doesn't really make any sense. There's really great post-Kantian work that you can cite that is done by women.
Right.
So, you know, yeah, I think it's all about, are you willing to, like you said, take a little bit of extra time and hopefully that little bit of extra time shrinks, right? It becomes easier and easier to do, and then there's less and less need to do it actively.
Right. I was just hoping my other hypothesis wasn't true, that white dudes need their opinions heard all the time, and that's why we hear so much from them in their works. So I don't know.
It's believable, right?
Yeah.
I think, especially as the sort of generational ongoing shift in moral luck occurs, you're gonna see a need for a lot of venting and purging.
Sounds good. All right, so on to our main topic, I suppose. So in my hand right here, I've got my copy of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Just finished it yesterday, and I wanted to talk to Aaron specifically about something he hadn't covered before in other avenues, and I knew he liked this book, and I was wondering if there was any way we could apply this idea in the book about metaphysical quality that Robert Pirsig sort of promotes, and seeing if we could apply it to our everyday lives or to issues beyond ourselves. And Aaron said, sure. So so I'll let you give an introduction to the concept. I'm not gonna lie; it's still hard to wrap my brain around the idea of Pirsig's metaphysical quality, partially at least, because he spends so much time throughout the book saying it can't be defined. So, like,
yep,
yeah,
it's a problem. So you want me to define the undefinable thing? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Please define the undefinable thing.
Right. Let me just get right on that. First off, I want to say I think your project is a good one, and it is the project of the book itself. He is very explicit in the book about saying that metaphysics that doesn't touch the ground in people's lives is worthless and should be thrown away. So hopefully we can get to the talk of where this becomes helpful for human beings dealing with the real world. But I guess first, to understand quality, I guess, is to understand sort of a broad cluster of concepts that he, and like, this is both his strength and his weakness. He pulls a lot of things into the idea of quality, and I think that's valuable, but it also is problematic sometimes. But I think, let's see, what we can say most basically is that quality is everything we are experiencing. That it is experience itself, I think, is probably the best way to put it in terms. Now, we should understand how he gets there, right? He starts off sort of coping with a very common dualistic problem that exists in classical philosophy between what we would think of as, in the Humean sense, is claims and ought claims, or evaluative claims, essentially judgments of quality, where we sort of common sense understand the idea, right? Good quality and bad quality are things like a very properly cooked meal versus one that's burned to a crisp. So he starts off with that very conventional kind of sense of quality, and he wants to understand what it is and defend it against attacks that he perceives from philosophy, especially from folks that you and I have talked about before, the kind of modernist view that wants to devalue quality and say it's not real. So he wants to say, well, what is this thing that we are claiming is not real? And in the process, he eventually gets to a metaphysical claim that the only real thing is quality. Everything is quality, and all of our experiences of reality come after that fact. So,
yeah, I know I've seen some resources compare it to the Tao, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's the biggest idea that he tries to pair it with. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, and the Tao is more or less just now I'm being tested on how well I paid attention to your podcast, but that's more or less just the way of things, I suppose, like the processes by which things happen. Is that Is that correct?
Yeah, that's one way of describing what is essentially an indescribable thing. And the reason he claims that it is indescribable, the same reason the Taoists will claim the Tao is indescribable, is that it precedes separation. It is sort of a radically undifferentiated entity. And I think the metaphysical reasoning behind that is that the Tao is really another word for what we often call substance, I think. Not purely physical substance, but the kind of substance that folks like Spinoza and Descartes have in mind when they think of a propertyless entity that is this underlying substrate for everything that we experience. So one key way to understand Pirsig is to understand him as a kind of substance monist. He's saying there's just one substance, and we're going to call it quality, even though like that word brings a lot of weird baggage with it. There's no word that doesn't bring some weird baggage with it, but this is the best we're going to do. And then from there, we can analyze different modes of experiencing that substance, but the substance itself is never divided into parts. It is radically unanalyzable.
Yeah, would it be comparable to say like just, you know, the universal processes, like everything that is happening basically as a process, rather than chunking it into here's a chair and here's, you know, here are some headphones, or these molecules make up me and these molecules aren't you, but it's just the entire process of everything.
Absolutely. Another friend of this theory would be the process style philosophy that you're talking about, that says things like God is a verb, right? That the mistake, one of the main mistakes the Buddhists were pointing out that I think he's cribbing from in this story is that we tend to understand the world as separate concrete objects, like you were saying, you, me, self, other, computer versus person, right? And that is functional on a certain level of understanding. But when we conflate that with what is actually the true reality, separate from our abstraction, separate from our judgments and our framing of it, that becomes unhealthy and problematic. And so we have to constantly keep in our mind this tension between knowing that what we are experiencing is in a sense real. These dualities are in a sense real, but they can be quieted. And in the process of quieting them, we can experience a less separate sense of reality. I got a little wooey there at the end.
Yeah, I know. I think, yeah, it does sound wooey. And I think, you know, I would have a hard time talking about it with sort of the Enlightenment centrist rationalists, who maybe the scientific contingent of like online internet atheism, which you know, very scientific, high focus on, say, rationality and everything. Like it almost seems like an idealistic metaphysics.
Oh, it is very much. It's phenomenology. It's basically full in committing to the idea that everything is phenomenon.
Okay.
And then like, well, here's what I would say. The difference between phenomena and noumena is a abstraction, and everything is really an undifferentiated thing that we can sometimes experience as raw phenomenon.
Right. So I mean, so what? So what are maybe a rationalist might...
So many terms, we should probably define some of these.
Yeah, I know. I'm when I'm talking about rationalists, I'm mostly throwing shade at internet edgelords who assume they know everything because they discovered who Sam Harris was.
Not to interject on your virtue signaling. I do get where you're coming from. I would say I deal with those folks every day.
Right.
I think with them, my first suggestion would be approach them the way that you were talking about it to me a little bit before the episode, right? With the meditation, right? Where you're describing you were sitting down trying to meditate at Chautauqua after you'd finished it, and you were listening to the music, right? And you were trying to experience it without judgment. And that I think is what he means in the most concrete sense of experiencing good quality. Now, I can give you an account of the metaphysics that is based in what I think is very good psychological Gestalt reasoning, if you want, and it might make it a little easier to present, but not that much, to be honest.
I think it'd be best if we contrasted it with with how, like, when I talk about these rationalists that I'm throwing shade at, I really shouldn't, because I was more or less in that camp a few years ago, and I'm not saying I'm superior to them now. I'm just saying I sort of grew out of that very epistemologically based rationalist scientismic school of thought in terms of like how I was introduced to like philosophy. So you know, that school of thought sees the world as like everything exists and can be more or less reduced to like quantum fields or particles or maybe strings or loops or whatever, and then everything builds up from there through a combination of matter and physical forces, and then we perceive that and we study it through methods of science and reasoning. And like I feel like if you were to introduce sort of more of an idealistic metaphysics where it sort of puts forward the idea that there's primacy in the idea of the thing before everything else, rather than the material, which most rationalists would probably assume the material is more supreme than the ideas to them.
Yeah. Well, there's some good tricks you can play here, right? So first of all, these folks do tend to also love Hume, and Hume, the radical empiricist,
or at least they say they do.
Right, Hume, the radical empiricist, sits pretty strongly opposite the rationalists. He doesn't believe in innate ideas. He believes that everything comes to us from experience, and in that sense, phenomena does have primacy over subject, object, or our physicalist accounts. I would also say that the account that you just gave is not incompatible with what Pirsig is arguing for. Pirsig would, I think, happily say one way to understand quality is to understand it in the form of quantum fields, right? And I'm not going to say that means that ESP is real or something, but like there are people like him and Ken Wilber who are effectively modern panpsychists, which means they think that there's a conscious element to everything. And what I think they mean is that there's no real clear dividing line between what is a mental feature and a physical feature, and that, like Spinoza, they think that the two things are probably attached all the way down, because for every external feature of something, there is an inner world to it of some sort, even if that inner world is just filled with the spin of a quantum particle, I think. And like that's the way that they would try to put it. I don't think that too much is at stake in pairing this together with quantum anything, right? I think we're fine with just pointing out that if you're really honest about empiricism, all that you have is phenomenal experience. And then you construct a bunch of models to try to describe that phenomenal experience, but they always come after the phenomenal experience.
Right. I think part of the any confusion might stem from when a lot of us are talking about like reality as it is, we aren't talking about the phenomena we experience and filtered through, you know, all of our filters and our chunking in our brain. We're talking about that which doesn't go away. Like if there's no persons in the universe, there's still a universe and there's still properties to the universe. And what you're describing is that there's phenomenology there, as in we're experiencing things and we're somewhat distorting and chunking that experience in a way that isn't truly how everything is. But in another sense, quality does imply to reality, as in that which is beyond our phenomenological experiences. So
yeah, that's a good summation of kind of the problem with these views. One of the main problems with panpsychism is that it does appear that consciousness as we understand it is a localized phenomenon. It does not exist throughout the world. It exists in very specific meat bags. So that is one major concern, right? And then I think you're right that the materialist, this is why idealism hasn't dominated the world. The materialist has a very solid pushback on the claim that we can't know things as they are in themselves, which is to say, if I can reliably predict the way that thing out there is going to behave, that's the equivalent of knowing the thing as it is in itself.
Right.
right? I still think that that's fine with Pirsig. I think that he
Mm-hmm.
would say that that's okay as long as you admit that one of the things that we are experiencing out there in the world is quality, and that
Mm-hmm.
that quality is very hard to differentiate from the things as they are in themselves.
Mm-hmm. Right,
So
and it does help us. I think there's a lot of value in sort of recognizing that there aren't really hard barriers to objects and phenomena and concepts and things. Like everything's flowing in and out of each other. You know, there's
yeah,
a constant ship of Theseus everywhere going on all the time due to molecular flux and everything. So
there's a popular argument in metaphysics that says that there are no objects, there are only atoms arranged object-wise.
right,
That
that's what is it?
Van Enwagen.
Yeah,
It's also yeah.
yeah. No, so that makes sense.
Well, no, it's an
It,
absurd claim, but when you think
uh,
about it for a while, it starts to make a little bit of sense,
right.
right? But it's one of those classic on your face absurd claims, much like quality is the primary thing, right? I
Right.
do. There is one other theory before I think we talk about like diving down a little bit out of the metaphysics, which I
Right.
think gets a little tiresome, is that there's this psychological backing to this theory that I've found in the form of Gestalt psychology, that
Hmm.
they make a very, very similar argument along the lines of all that the primary thing that exists is the contact boundary between the self and the other. We talked about
Hmm.
this on an earlier Embrace the Void, that like again, the self and the other are abstractions that don't exist until they have experienced something at that contact boundary. And so again,
Hmm.
the phenomenal experience is primary, and the abstraction of, well, this is me and that is you comes afterwards.
Hmm.
So I do think that they do some really good work about how um, healthy flexibility in the way that you engage with the contact boundary is the most functional method towards flourishing. And I
Hmm.
think Pirsig's goal in Zen is to make a similar kind of argument that flexibility with regard to quality is the most functional method to achieving a life of flourishing.
Hmm.
And it's
Right.
again the same thing the Taoists say, right? Be flexible with regard to the Tao.
Right. And it's not like Pirsig is dismissing uh science. In fact, like the first like 10 chapters, he's talking about, epistemology and how to test and how to actually he does talk about motorcycle maintenance in the first 10 chapters and
Mm-hmm.
looking at it through either a romantic or a what's the word,
Classical.
a classical manner, and just trying to fix it. So deal of he finds a great deal of value in hard epistemology and everything. But
Yeah.
it's do you think so? I guess there's a spoiler warning. I'm not sure if it's a spoiler, but like he sort of has an alternate persona.
Yeah.
And when he's talking about motorcycle maintenance and using rationality and science to solve certain problems, like for example, like a broken motorcycle or anything, do you think any of that comes from him not aligning with his old persona being the one who promotes promotes the idea of quality as foundational and fundamental, or do you think
Mm.
Pirsig's character still believes in it?
I think it's an
Like,
attempt to synthesize the positions.
mhm.
His sort of reincarnated form, whatever you think about his particular story and whatnot. I think his reincarnated form sees the mistakes that the first person that was him made and aims to try to avoid them by synthesizing the things that that Phaedrus couldn't synthesize. And like I want to point out, Pirsig is the epitome of an unreliable narrator in this story.
Mhm.
Like you couldn't have a less reliable narrator. So, and like he goes to great lengths to point that out himself. He's constantly pointing out that like Phaedrus wasn't actually that good of a philosopher. He wasn't that rigorous of a
Right,
philosopher, right? And that like his new incarnation is kind of a crowd pleaser, right? So all that being
right.
said, I
And,
do
and
think,
and
yeah,
his persona just fought. Aristotelians to
Yeah.
get fans, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, right. Stirring ancient Greek fans.
Right.
Um,
But you know, there's one, I think one of the foundational or one of the sparks towards Phaedrus's development of quality is like him examining scientific hypotheses, and he comes across a problem like you know, for any like phenomenon or theory, there are, you know, basically infinite hypotheses to explain a phenomenon. And like I think that really ties into quality, because quality kind of breaks down the barriers between, you know, this explanation for a scientific phenomena or another one. But like even before you come across Phaedrus's difficulty in trying to solve that, you know, Pirsig has already gone through multiple methods of like testing and retesting and looking for solutions. So like he's very functional. So I do think I do think there's a bit more value that rationalists are missing out on by not having this quality-based view, because I don't think a lot of self-proclaimed science enthusiasts actually understand, you know, the fundamental methods of science, and not recognizing that like building hypotheses and testing, like that's all guessing. Like that comes to your head through educated information, but like if you're going to come up with an explanation, you have to like have some sort of guess that just comes to you more or less by luck. So
yeah, he takes a very analytic scientific approach to the problem of quality. So there's the wonderful part in the book where he proves to his students that they know quality when they see it. And this is a passage that I do think that anyone and like, so your broad point is correct, right? He doesn't want to tear down science. He wants to raise up quality to being as real, at least, if not more primary, but at least as real as the things that we think of as the physical world. And he does this first by taking all of his students and presenting them with a bunch of different papers of different quality and proving that they can reliably group the good and bad papers based on quality without even needing to be taught specific rules about it, right? And then he finds, once he's realized that you can prove that quality is real, it becomes useful to have all of those analytic, classic quality kind of rules that allow one to figure out how to better achieve what feels like, I think, romantic quality eventually.
Yeah. So I do want to get to how we can apply this framework, but before we do, are we missing anything else fundamentally about like this
No, I mean,
theory?
I think you're right about the scientific hypothesis part as well, right? So obviously people pick hypotheses, and there are better and worse hypotheses, right? ESP, not the best hypothesis. For example.
You're trying to cover your ass now.
No, I'm just stirring shit with myself to get fans. I'm not even a self. I can stir with whoever I want. No, quality is the thing that allows us to tell why one hunch is better than another, even if we don't have a perfect rational explanation yet. Right? So it can come in a lot of different forms, but I think the way I tend to experience hypothesis formation is that it's a kind of Gestalt formation, by which I mean a bunch of pieces within your brain sort of find connections that piece themselves together into what eventually becomes a coherent picture. And then you have a hypothetical model that you can see how reliably testable it is.
Yeah. And I could imagine like examples for, you know, even non-accurate hypotheses can still be useful. Like one of the paradigmatic examples of evolution in scientific thought is, say, the model of the atom. And we can think of, you know, at first there's just like material as it is, and then there's like a cloud of positive and negative charges. Then there's the plum pudding model, and then the Bohr model, and so on, until we get to our conception today, which is more probably the best explanation we have of the atom as it can be without going into like the makeup of the fundamental particles below it. And you can see that, you say the Bohr model, well, or the plum pudding model rather, like that hypothesis is not as high quality as our current model, but it still has quality and it has use for us of some sort.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So we've established that quality and looking at quality can actually improve our scientific practice. So I think we're on a good roll. Were there any examples that you thought were good that you'd bring up today as to how thinking of things qualitatively, I don't know if that's the right term, but how that can help us in day-to-day life?
Sure. So to me, using quality in everyday life actually turns into what I would prefer to call the term mindfulness, which is just a practice of trying to continuously find quality even in varying quality environments, right? Trying to embrace the void, basically. So this can take a lot of different forms. So one problem you often see with human beings that Pirsig, I think, accurately points out is that they tend to favor one kind of quality over another. They either really like romantic quality, which is the like undifferentiated, but often sort of conflated with like surface appearance, right? So the motorcycle's external look and how pretty it is or something.
And how it functions. Like they think of it as a vehicle that moves. Like that's the...
Yeah, but even less sort of analyzed than that. Like literally just the awe factor of like looking at the really pretty painting or something, right?
Okay.
And then there is classical quality, which is the underlying structure and a pleasure towards the underlying structure or an understanding of it that allows one to see the quality in it. So being able to understand why having this piece here and this piece here is better than swapping them around for overall efficiency, for example, or the way you were describing earlier, where when you're trying to fix the machine, right, trying to find where the bad quality is. Is there a leak somewhere, right? Is there an excess of oil in some place?
Right, it's getting more and more atomized. You have sort of like you have your propulsion system, and that can be further broken down into the gas tank, like the engine, the spark plug, things like that. And then in the classical quality terms, the motorcycle is just like the system that is this hierarchy of things, more or less, rather than the superficial shiny metal thing with two wheels or whatever. So,
and much like he doesn't want to denigrate science to raise up quality, he doesn't want to denigrate classical quality to raise up romantic quality. He thinks that classical quality has actually kind of gotten a bad rap, but at the same time, the people who value classical quality have really lost sight of the value of romantic quality. They've mistaken the map for the landscape, as it were, and they're completely caught up in their reified, abstracted notions of reality. And from a sort of basic human psychology perspective, he thinks that's what produces what we would sort of call squares, right? People who can't have fun, who can't feel the groove.
I love his terminology there.
It's square in itself, I know. But like, I do think he's right that the useful abstractions, and you see the same thing in Gestalt psychology again as well, the useful abstractions become fixations that become neuroses that prevent flexible searches for better quality or flexible ways to deal with the problematic quality. And so by doing things like meditating, by stepping away from that constant drumbeat of classical quality analysis, you let a little room in for, in theory, romantic quality, and that allows one to not be so caught up in that uptight way of thinking.
Right. So do you think an emphasis on romantic quality over classic quality can it sounds a little more humanistic, if it were, there's like like it's I don't know. There's a very, you know, scientific stance like that. All that matters is like data and things that can be proven. I guess it's a bit positivistic, but again, I think that's a problem with the types of folks we like to confront, which are, you know, if it's like, you know, give us a citation or a peer-reviewed paper or GTFO, and I don't know if romantic quality could get us closer to, you know, recognizing that there's other ways to arrive at the truth, or to arrive at positive ethical behaviors, or how to treat other humans fairly or ethically, that you wouldn't necessarily get from classical quality.
Well, I think you can gain value for yourself if you can learn to notice that individuals are more moved by romantic or classical quality, and if your goal is to persuade them, approach them with the kind of material that they're going to find more accessible. I also think that there is a flip side to that kind of group, which is, like you said, the humanists, who sometimes I think will tend a little too far into romantic quality and will lose sight of the value of classical quality,
Right.
much like his friends
Fucking
do.
postmodernists. So.
Right, exactly. Great. Now we're screwed.
I defended postmodernism in an earlier hangout, so I don't know.
I defend postmodernism as being an important but past stepping stone that we should all move on from.
Yeah. I describe myself as a postmodernism sympathizer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Pirsig is too, right? He's basically saying the modernists, the naive modernists, need to take a step back and recognize that everything comes to us as a phenomenal experience through a filtered system, and that the best we can do is find better quality, better gradients of quality within that system.
Yeah. I think this actually ties into my last hangout with Dr. Christy Winters, because that whole hangout was about, you know, storytelling in science. And like, if you read a scientific paper, like it's structured like a story. Like there's an introduction, there's background, there's a section on how you did the experiment, and then like you have the data. And as much as empiricists, some I'll just say empiricists that haven't thought this out much may not like to admit, but a lot of scientific data requires interpretation. Like when you're reading a paper, a lot of the time, say it's a science paper, and you're looking at something like a gas chromatograph, you don't get results that like a movie of a molecule bumping into another or reacting or something. What you get is like a graph with a peak right here, and you have to make inferences and say this peak corresponds to this molecule. So if there's a bigger peak, then you have more of this compound, or less of a peak. So in that sense, like there's that interpretation from the science. Like there's phenomenology going on as you read the paper. Not to mention, you know, the only evidence you have is something that another human wrote down and claims to have found in his lab. And the only way you can be certain of that is if you try and replicate that experiment. And even then, you know, it could be wrong. But like you more or less trust that the person in this paper is, and the editors and the other peer reviewers think it's being relayed accurately.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the sort of other point that I felt like you were making there about how the quality of the writing, even in a science paper, matters, is a very important sort of on the ground example of why we should care about quality, and also specifically why we should care about developing our appreciation for both romantic and classical quality. So I think one of the reasons that 90% of academic philosophical papers are just unreadable is because there's a little bit too much emphasis on classical quality in the form of perfectly structured logical prose, and zero concern for, is this accessible? Now, that's not true of all things. There are a lot of really good accessible philosophy writers, people like Dennett and Nagel, who I think write in more comprehensible for normal people terms. But this is a major problem, and I think that's why when I teach writing, while I do teach how important structure is, I try to clarify how that structure is important because it provides a good quality experience for your reader, in the sense that they won't get lost, they won't, you know, misunderstand you at any point and end up hating you. Like you can work that stuff in a way that appeals to how humans actually experience reality, rather than demanding that humans adopt a perfectly classical quality approach when they are reading your papers to get through them.
Right. Let's take this back to the very beginning of the show. You brought up, you know, one of the reasons we're interested in there might be a resurgence in philosophical media is, you know, that we are required to defend our humanity. That's almost taken as a given now on online discourse. I'm wondering if a bigger emphasis on quality would actually, you know, sort of, you know, I don't want to say eliminate, because that sounds too strong, but it would rectify a lot of the problems there. Like defend that I should, you know, use the pronouns that you ask me to, or something like that. You need, or this slur I'm just using, that's just a word. It's not magical. It doesn't have any it doesn't have any classical quality to it when you say a slur, but it has a lot of negative romantic quality that doesn't actually help the discourse.
Yeah, I think, like with most strong arguments, and I think Pirsig presents a fairly strong argument overall, you're gonna peel off some people who are unsure, but you're not gonna convince the people who don't want to be convinced. Right? So for people who are genuinely trying to understand why should we care so much about words, helping them to understand why quality is as real as physical harm or something like that is valuable. I think it helps them to, part of what we're doing when we're doing quality work or mindfulness work or any of these things is just trying to engender empathy towards the world around us, in the sense of just trying to be able to experience it without first filtering it through all of our shields, basically. That's not going to do anything for the people who genuinely believe that the higher quality thing is a, you know, to the death hateful discourse that somehow produces better, I don't know, intellectual quality, even if it's at the cost of it being a toxic environment for the vast number of people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I also might add that, you know, I think a lot of people who are at least attempting to dismiss anything but classical quality might, they still have their own filters. They have their own biases and experience. They've had their own experiences of quality, and they're bringing that through the table. So like a very privileged person is seeing it through that lens, and they've never had to recognize that other people's experiences are, they don't line up. So like I think it's fairly basic to say that your experiences shape the way you think and view the world, and say a privileged person might see their romantic quality as just as classical quality. It might just like that's just the way things are. Like, you know, they'll take for granted, you know, systemic issues as just the way things are. Like, oh no, we can't. Like, I pulled up myself up by my bootstraps and things like that. I was able to get along fine in life. You're just lazy, instead of accepting other people's quality experiences.
Yeah, it's the Ben Shapiro line, facts don't care about your feelings.
Right.
Right, which
but
is to say feelings don't matter and aren't real, and facts are the only things that exist.
Right, but I do think I think they are unwittingly bringing to the table their own romantic quality without realizing that their feelings also matter.
They're sure, right? They are smuggling in their own experiences of romantic quality, and they are being a little bit disingenuous about their accounts of classical quality, right? I mean, as a result of doing so, they're when they chunk the world, they deliberately leave out a large part of it for some people while allowing themselves to still include it in their data sets.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I agree with you.
That makes me think. So do you think, in that sense, quality helps us eliminate sort of essentialism in a sense? Like this hierarchy is one thing. I didn't know. This could tie in intersectionality and everything, but just like, there's not one way to experience. Like, I don't know. I think people are always bringing their assumptions to the table, and like, what am I trying to say? My brain is circling, but it like social norms. I'll just give an example. Like, we're both pro trans people. We have a lot of trans people in our lives, and there's sort of a way of chunking the world in which trans people don't exist or something.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an essentialist, like that's gender essentialism or whatever. And I've never been an essentialist. I think it's hard to come up with some sort of, platonic ideal for every little thing. But but when you talk about, say, here's a trans woman, like when I talk to a woman or somebody says they're a woman to me, I don't hold those essential qualities against them, because like no matter what type of woman it is, I never like ask them for their ID, their birth certificates. I don't check their junk or whatever. It's more of an idea that transcends like these categories that we've put in place before,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good example of their sort of they have this system of science, and they think that science tells them this one thing about people. That's the classical quality side of it, and they're unwilling to consider the romantic quality of the individuals, their felt experiences, their internal states of knowing that they should be this other person, or they should be in this other body, or however they want to frame it. And so, yeah, I think it is that same, whenever I think about this stuff, I always think of Lebowski, because everything comes back to Lebowski. But there's a point in Lebowski where he like figures out that everything is this giant complicated ruse, and he says, "Oh, my thinking had gotten so uptight." There's a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what have yous, and then like he figures it out, and like what that to me is, it's sort of a constant reminder that our minds always tend towards this uptight classical quality account of the world, and while that is valuable, it can often blind us to very important things that we're not even considering as data points. Like, for example, the actual lived experiences of trans people.
I'm thinking of some of the honor culturalists on Monster Island, and one of the common rebuttals to, whenever we give an argument for, maybe this is the case or that is the case, a lot of the times they'll just appeal to, well, that's just not the way things are. Like I live the way things are. And I think that's just very much essentializing everything, and assuming that their experiences are universal or something. I don't know if I would say that quality could dissolve honor culture, but like
I would well, following Bill Hicks, I would recommend a healthy dose of psilocybin mushrooms. My first diagnosis.
Right.
Nothing breaks down the self-other distinction like mushrooms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's. I have not tried mushrooms despite being in Boulder for 4 years, so we'll see if that changes. Did you have any other thoughts that we didn't get to touch on regarding this metaphysical framework?
I guess my thought would be, a little bit worry less about the metaphysical framework if it bothers you, and attend to the direct experience of quality, right? That's sort of his whole point, right? The metaphysics of quality is a classical quality analysis of the direct experience of quality itself. Ideally, you should be working towards both being able to have that analytic analysis, but also to be able to sit and reflect on direct perceived romantic quality.
Right.
And so figuring out how to do that. So this to me is an everyday practice, is find the quality in every activity. And I'm amazed that there are individuals who've told me they've read this book 4 times, but like don't even realize that that's sort of what he's getting at when he's talking about, sitting there with the machine and not seeing it as an ugly, angry, broken machine, but finding the quality in the process of picking through the parts and figuring it out. And if you can do that, you can really find quality in everything, even arguing with horrible people online, right? It's everywhere, because quality, again, is everywhere. The only reason we can't experience it is our abstractions. Now, that doesn't mean you achieve an enlightenment utopia, right? He went through a personal breakdown, and I don't think that this system fully eliminates suffering. It just eases the suffering a little bit, right? Because you don't attach to the suffering, you don't identify with it, and it passes a little more quickly, or the fear reactions pass a little more quickly. There's a variety of ways in which I think the untightening is really important, even if you don't care about which came first, quality or physical objects.
Right. I will say I do feel a mild concern. Like, I don't even know if it's a concern, but a lot of these things like mindfulness practice, I've been digesting a lot of Stoic content, and of course, like Buddhism too. Like, there's a lot of overlap there. I was gonna make a joke about there not being barriers between those things.
That's right.
Like, I could, but
all one quality.
I am mildly. I don't know if it is a concern, but a lot of those philosophies do seem to focus on individuals and the self, and I think that's good. Like, I think my meditation practice has helped me cope with my ADHD a little. I think learning about some of the teachings of some of the Stoics has helped my outlook, but I'm concerned because like there's a lot more to like there's a lot more to social issues than just how I interact with the world. There's like I'm concerned that there's not it has the same problems that like Enlightenment rationality has, which is it doesn't account for large systems of things and how to overcome those. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as a Buddhist or and a social justice proponent.
Well, I think the criticism of, especially of the classic models of this stuff, is well founded. My good philosophy friend Brian has pointed out that oftentimes things like Taoism can stop being a method to improve the world and start being a method to make yourself just numb to how bad the world is. And I think you're right that raises a concern that in being cool with whatever, man, we're not pushing for social change. I think the solution there is to bring back front and center the moral luck stuff. I always come back to it because it allows one to see quality on all these different scales and see how all the qualities are tied together, and how we have to constantly be engendering so much empathy towards all these other people because of their different experiences of quality. So I think like the Buddhists have what's called the Bodhisattva code, where they say, I will not escape reincarnation until everyone has escaped reincarnation, basically. Right? I will not transcend until everyone is transcended. And I think that as long as you hold to that in a legitimate kind of way and pay it forward and don't just use this stuff to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others, then it becomes a very functional model for helping those people while reducing your empathy burnout, which is something we're all suffering from right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think the concern is more along the lines of I could be the most ethical person on the planet, and still I have only so much influence or capacity to change. Like, I think there's a lot of value in acting as a role model, like acting in the way that others can see, and your actions can help them reflect positively upon the world. But like, you know, at the same time, me trying to practice to be a better person can only do so much in a
Yeah.
in a social context, in a systemic context.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to that systemic critique. One thing I will say is, of course, even with such a broad philosophy as Pirsig's, it's unrealistic to expect that any one philosophy will cover all the bases, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is predominantly a theory about getting our internal experiences in a better sort of order. And he goes on in Lila a little bit to talk a little bit more about large scale systems. But I think we can take from his stuff these valuable things and just find the other things, the other quality in other places that fills in those other blanks. It's, be afraid of anyone who sticks by just one book, including Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Right. And I guess, I wasn't sure if it was really a concern, because you could also take the uncharitable way I said that. I'm basically saying this philosophy isn't a panacea for every problem that exists in the world. So, it would be unrealistic to expect any sort of one theory to go beyond its own scope. So no, I take that to heart.
Though I will say, I mean, it is, like utilitarianism, a very broadly applicable theory. The quality stuff can be applied to types of governance. You can talk about what is better and worse quality of governance in terms of how does it engage the people with their individual experiences of quality? Does it force them into one kind of quality, or does it allow for an experience of vast of different kinds of quality? Does it degrade their very ability to experience quality? Right? Are they ground down by monotonous work like late stage capitalism does, so that we're all kind of a nerd to philosophy or to quality?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So, cool. So, now that I've read the book, I will probably be trying to view everything I experience a little more through that framework. Maybe I'll revisit it sometime. But I think this was great, and I appreciate you taking an hour of your evening out to discuss apparently one of your favorite topics. So it was a lot of fun for me, and I think I did get this. I'm glad you explained this book for me.
Well, I mean, I've had 20 years with this book, and I feel like I'm just starting to get the hang of it a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. It is, and that's partly because he's imprecise sometimes. Let's be honest. It's not, I could do a whole nother hour on critiques of this. But I think it's good that there's value there, and that we can bring attention to it in a very practical kind of way.
Yeah, at the moment, I wouldn't want to be like a radical Phaedrist, as it were, just like radical. His philosophy had some problems, as I might have mentioned earlier, but like, I think a push towards this, at the very least, could have a lot of value, like just at least a good hefty push towards quality philosophy.
And Pirsig admits at the climax that like Phaedrus is an axe grinder. He's not there to learn, he's there to win. And so he has to admit
self-describes as a sophist.
Yeah. So. And like I get that part of it. Like I understand, and I think it's a really interesting sort of pushback on the historical narrative of Socrates and the sophists. But I think he's also clearly quite biased against the Socratics. And like there's a lot of quality in Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And what he had was a bad quality experience with a philosophy professor, basically.
Cool. So my platform is much smaller than yours right now, but nonetheless, please plug your stuff. You can maybe describe what Embrace the Void and OGP, as it were, what you do with those things.
Yeah, so they're both educational philosophy podcasts with slightly different bents. Embrace the Void is an attempt to use things like Stoicism and a variety of the philosophical ideas that we've talked about here to survive this, the worst of all possible timelines. And that's been wonderful. It's been great to find a lot of people who want to hear about a bunch of different philosophical topics to fill that ever-expanding existential void. And then Philosophers in Space is a slightly more lighthearted romp through all of science fiction, where week by week we take an episode and we use it as a hook to convince people to talk about philosophy even more. We Trojan horse it real good. And, we've done Rick and Morty. We've done all the a lot of the very popular shows, Westworld. But we're also doing sort of lesser well-known stuff. We've done a couple of Philip K. Dick short stories. And it's really been great. And I've been doing that with Thomas Smith, and the other one is with my great friend GW.
Yeah, it was fun being your GW for this episode. Like, ask questions, because GW is kind of he asks good questions, and I'm glad he's there. Yeah, he is very pretty, and he actually does challenge me on the island too, which is nice, because I think he is a very good faith interlocutor. So,
yeah, if you want to see the horror show that is a qualityless, unfettered debate landscape, you can always come join Monster Island on Facebook. Make sure you answer all the questions.
You're gonna get more leftists in there or whatever.
Yeah, I've already got a quota of leftists already. Yeah, we're doing affirmative action for conservatives right now.
Yeah, like what we want to do with colleges and universities, right?
Yep.
Yeah. But it'll help balance out the Nazis, because those guys are just awful. So
we do have some genuine Nazis.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much. I think this will close it out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and listening.
Thanks for having me.
And this was a lot of fun. So thanks, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.